different types of tracks, simply as much as knowing which of these are ascending and descending. That's it. Okay? This is a very complicated area, far more complicated than I want to get into, far more complicated than I truly even know, beyond my comprehension as well. So I'm going to leave it very simple, and we're going to talk about first the ascending tracks, and then we're going to talk about the descending tracks. Okay, and again, I'll make it simple for you to understand what I'm going to be asking of you guys. This is a simple example. Okay, this is not a picture you're ever going to see, but it just shows you in general how something like an ascending track works. Okay? And I'll come to these terms, desiccation, in just a few minutes, so don't worry about that. Okay? So if you notice here, this entire page on page 6 is all devoted toward ascending tracks. And page 7 is devoted to a descending track. That's the big picture for each of those. Okay? So ascending tracks, that means tracks that are going to go up. They're sensory signals, up the cord, to the control center, to the brain. We have these tracks, they consist of 3 sets of neurons. 3. So what that means is, okay, I prick my finger, I feel that pain, and there's going to be 3 different neurons that are going to be involved in transmitting that signal to my brain for me to interpret that as pain. Okay? 3 different neurons will be the information highway that takes it to the brain. Now there's going to be all kinds of connections in my brain that decide about that pain and do responses to that pain. But the information that gets to the brain, that passageway, goes through 3 different neurons. We call it first order neuron, second order neuron, and third order neuron. So yes, you should be familiar with these examples. So ascending tracks consist of 3 neurons we call first order, second order, and third order neurons. To give you an example of how that works, it's just one example. Okay, I'll show you this one right here. So we have some sort of information that's picked up by some receptor. Okay? We might have pressure, pain, or body movement, or some other sensory perception. We have a receptor somewhere over here. Okay? That information is relayed along this single neuron, we call the first order neuron, all the way here, where its synapse is right here. Can you see that connection? So this is where that one first axon ends, and this is where the next neuron picks up the information. So there's a single synapse right here. Now that occurs in different parts of the body, I should say different parts of the brain or cord. This happens to be in the medulla of the brain. Okay? That's something we're not going to get into. Sometimes it's the cord, sometimes it's different parts of the hindbrain and other things like that. It just depends on the information. But there's a synapse. At that point, the second neuron now picks up that information and is transmitted again up the cord. It goes all the way up to the thalamus. We're going to talk about the thalamus in greater detail next week. The thalamus is the gateway to the cerebral cortex. What do I mean by that? Well, since we haven't covered the brain yet, I can't tell you exactly. This is why we're limited today. But for simplicity, what I want you to think about is, okay, here's the surface of the brain. It's all wrinkly like that, right? Different parts of the surface of that brain are devoted toward different sensations. So we might have hearing and eyesight and balance, etc., etc. Okay? For simplicity, we'll think about it that way. So the information that comes up here has to be sent to the right area to be interpreted, right? So you can imagine that we're going to have some sort of relay station that's going to determine where it needs to go. Does that make sense? That connection, the gateway to the cerebral cortex, or the surface of the brain right there, is called the thalamus. And that's where you see that final synapse to the third order neuron. Okay? And then that third order neuron then will go up to that area of the brain, and then again, that's where all the magic happens. Right? That's where we get more information. We can understand it. We can even have responses to it. We can build it into memory, and all kinds of other things can happen as a result of that original sensation. We call that ascending tracks. Understand the general idea? Okay, now let's talk about the 5 different types. You need to know the 5 types are down at the bottom. Okay? At least be able to understand the terms, which is really all I'm going to ask you to really know. So We have, the first two are a little bit trickier in the sense that the name is a little bit complicated, but the other three, or four as it really is, all start off with spino. Spino. So you're going to see spinothalamic, spinal-reticular, anterior spinocerebellar, or posterior spinocerebellar tracts. So these spino blank tracts are ascending. The two that are also ascending, that are a little bit harder to remember, are gracile fasciculus and cuneate fasciculus. Now, what are these? Well, again, go back to this right here, and it shows you the picture. And again, I would never ask you to identify these or anything like that. And this picture is not going to be an exam, but it just shows you right here what this is. So right here in the cord, these tracts right here are involved in deep pressure and sensation of the part of the body below T6. So we have T6 and everything below, all that perception of things like body movements or the position of our joints. That information is relayed up the gracile fasciculus. Everything above T6 is done with cuneate fasciculus. Okay. That's the only thing there. Other tracts do other functions. You can see here, pain, pressure, light, touch, tickle, and itch are all involved in what they call spinothalamic. Again, I wouldn't expect you to be able to spit that back out and tell me, so I'm not going to, I couldn't do that myself. I never learned these things myself, so I'm not going to ask the same for me. Spinal is involved in tissue injury, so we have actual pain caused by tissue itself being damaged. It's on the spinal reticular. And then the last ones are involved in the cerebellum. And you're like, what does that mean? Well, you're going to learn it again, kind of jumping ahead of ourselves. The cerebellum is this kind of mini brain in the back of your brain. That's the way to describe it. Okay? It has one basic main, well, it's a main function, but one of the main functions it does is it helps you come up with a blueprint for moving. A blueprint for moving. What does that mean? Well, it kind of maps out your body position. It says, okay, you want to walk, fine. Let's look at where your body is. Okay, your left foot's in front of your right. So the next thing you want to do is you want to move your leg up like this and down. And you want to, okay, now you're in a different position. You want to do this and then this. It's going to come up with a blueprint. It's going to read your current body position and then send the blueprints to the rest of the brain that's involved in moving your body. So it has to receive information on body position to do that. And that's these tracts right here. Okay? So the posterior and anterior spinocerebellar tracts are involved in really determining body position. Okay? We call that proprioceptive signals. We'll learn more about that in chapter 16 a couple weeks from now. What about descending? Descending. I have a typo. I need to fix it. It's right there in the middle of page 7. It says, we will now describe the major ascending tracts. It should say major descending tracts because I never corrected it. I forgot. So please correct me on that. It should say major descending tracts. Okay. Descending tracts are tracts that carry information down from the control center to effectors, glands, or muscles. It consists of two types of neurons. We have upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. And that's kind of weird to think about. What do I mean? Well, if I decide to move my hand voluntarily right here, it's weird to think that there's only two cells that separate the top of my brain right here and my fingers. But there are only two. Two neurons, one synapse, one physical connection. The body cells, or the neuron cells that are involved in that are right here, in what we call the motor cortex. This is the part of the brain we'll learn about next week that's involved in voluntary movement, or muscles like this. So the actual cells, or the soma, are right here. Here are the axons coming all the way down. Okay? All the way down here. Now what I want you to notice here, this is where I pause for a minute to come back, there's a bit of a crisscross. See that? See how it starts up on this side and then crosses over? This one comes here and crosses over. You ever heard of the left brain controls your right side of the body? And yeah, vice versa? That's why. We have desiccation, or crossing over. Not everything crosses over, but some things do. So we do have some of that. So, they always say, if you're left-handed, you're in your right mind, kind of thing, all those funny little jokes. So that's because of that. So at least with voluntary motor control, there is truth to that. Your right brain controls your left side and vice versa. And it's because of this crossing over that occurs right here in the medulla of the brain. So you have upper motor neuron. This is an upper motor neuron over here. We start at the top this time because we're going down. Okay? So descending start up here. This is upper motor neuron. We're going down, 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 down. And we finally end up having the synapse right here. So right here in the spinal cord. So let's say we want to have some sort of movement in our arms. Well, cell starts off here, sends out an axon all the way down to the cervical vertebrae, whatever that would be, okay? And right there, it'll synapse. You can see where it actually synapses right here in the gray matter. Again, that's where the synapses occur. And then right here, you have another cell in the axon, and notice where it's coming from. If you're very, very observant here, it's coming out of the ventral root. Why? Ventral root is for motor control. And that'll go out to the skeletal muscles. And that is the lower motor neuron. So you only have two. That's important. Well, why? Very, very fast movements. How do we get such fast movements? Because we only have one synapse. The less synapses, the faster the activity can be done. You can have a very fast response because we only have one synapse. The more synapses you have, the slower things are going to get. Makes sense. As far as the descending tracks, these are real simple because they all end in spinal. So the ascending, with the exception of two, started with spino. The descending all end with spinal. Okay? Now, they didn't always used to be the case. When I was in school, they used to call the top ones the pyramidal tracks, but they got smarter, made it easier for people to remember. So the cortical spinal tracks are probably the most important. You'll probably learn in anatomy. You might even get into more detail in 1 or 2, I'm not sure. It depends on the teacher. But they call this the pyramidal tracks. And these are what we're showing you right here. So the voluntary muscle control for most of your limbs are involved here. Okay? So finely coordinated limb movements like the legs and the arms are done with the cortical spinal or pyramidal tract. And you'll see some of these, again, you'll see some of the tracks when we get to the brain next week. You'll see these little ridges on the surface of the brain, certain areas of the brain. And that's actually those tracks. They make little ridges, and the brain kind of has a little ridgy appearance. That's what that is. Other ones are involved in other kinds of reflexes. For example, if you hear something, turn your head, there you go. I always have to do that, right? That response to sight and sound is hectospinal. So that's a physical response to sight and sound. Some other ones are involved in pain signals. I'm going to get into all that detail. And then balance as well. So you can imagine the brain has to coordinate muscle tone to maintain balance, and that's not here as well. Okay. So again, just know those names. So an example of what I would do there is I could say, okay, which of the following is an example of a descending track? Which of the following is an example of an ascending track? Okay. I think it should be simple, but I'm just giving you a heads up. That's the kind of question I'm going to ask on that. How are we doing in time? I think it's a good time to take a break. What do you think? You agree?